Hello and happy Valentine's Day, Cover Killer Nation. Oh wait, it's not Valentine's Day anymore. It's still Cover Killer Nation, but it's time for us to talk about some dark, murky music that was made in a dark and murky place. A place that gets a lot of rain. No, they're not all going to be from there either. We're going to talk about some grunge bands today in today's list, and it's not going to be all ones that are based in Seattle, because, like it or not, grunge was principally located in the Seattle area. However, they were not completely all in the Seattle area or based around the Seattle area. So this is what I'm going to call the 10 best grunge bands. And this is not necessarily my favorites in the top 10 order, but it's going to be bands that are extremely influential or have had one of the longest marks on the genre throughout its history. So let's start with number 10. Number 10 is going to be the Stone Temple Pilots. Now you might be wondering, why the hell is this band not higher up on the list? They're still active today, and Scott Weiland is arguably one of the most eccentric and wild and crazy vocalists out there. Well, the main reason for this is because the only real trace of the grunge sound that you can find with Stone Temple Pilots would be on their debut album, Core, and then choice elements in their discography afterwards. Yes, Stone Temple Pilots is a tremendously classic band. They are definitely one of the groups that really helped define the 90s, and even in their recent incantation, their work is not necessarily as good or as solid as it was, but it's still not bad. It's really just coming down to the fact that their element and their effect on grunge was principally felt on the album Core. Core was kind of the non-Seattle hybrid, clone of what you would hear from bands such as Nirvana, Soundgarden, and Alice in Chains, kind of all wrapped together. And one of the biggest principal influences was Where the River Flows, the very last track off of Core. This really showcased the grunge sound to a T. Number 9 is the Screaming Trees. Like it or not, even if you don't really know very much about these guys, the Screaming Trees were one of the longer-running grunge bands, and Mark Langan had his hand and his feet in many of the classic grunge projects. Not to mention, he's also rumored right now to be the person providing the vocals on the second Mad Season album, which is finally going to see the light of day, hopefully in the coming year or so. So, yeah, this is a guy that's had a surprising reach on this community. Not to mention, the Screaming Trees also had somebody, well, that you probably know and love pretty well in their ranks for a little while, and that's Josh Homme. If you don't know who Josh Homme is, where you been? Think of bands such as Caius or Queens of the Stone Age. Number 8, we're going to get into some of the ladies of the grunge element. We're going to get into bands such as 7 Year Bitch, Hole, and L7. This is principally because whenever you think of grunge, whenever you rattle off the names of grunge, you principally think of it as a man's game. Well, that's where you would be wrong. Bands such as 7 Year Bitch, Hole, and L7 were able to define the grunge philosophy in many different locations. 7 Year Bitch was able to do it while centered in Seattle. Hole was able to do it while they were in LA, and L7 was also primarily based in the Seattle area, but it showcased itself all up and down the West Coast. There's actually a lot of tiny bands that were kind of a part of the grunge scene that never really made it onto the national radar. However, they were just as principal in showcasing that women were able to really do the whole grunge sound thing just as well, if not better. Think about all of those annoying songs that perhaps played on Song Pop, if you played the game Song Pop on Facebook, and you don't really know who the hell they are because they're a bunch of women and you're used to, bands such as Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, and Nirvana. Well, there you go. That's who they are. They're fantastic bands. They really showcased a real new element to it. There's definitely a raw edge to it and an attitude that is uncompromised. That's the one part about their side of grunge that really shined forth aside from the rest. Number 7, Nirvana. I'm sure a lot of people just looked at him like, Nirvana, number 7? Why aren't they number 1, Cover Killer Nation? Well, while Nirvana did have one of the most important albums in grunge history, the one that really set it on the map, Nevermind, that's kind of where the story of, Kurt Cobain just sort of begins to become interesting. And while I don't think that the albums that followed it really matched its mystique, they really weren't meant to. Kurt was never meant to be a big superstar. He never wanted to be a big superstar. In fact, his whole entire rags to riches to Bits story was kind of a sad one. He basically got everything that he didn't want, and in the end, he ended up dead. So he's kind of the ideal, martyr for the grunge scene, and supposedly the grunge scene died along with him, which is not 100% true, but a big chunk of it definitely died with him. However, these guys were a band that kind of were almost a second wave band, though they were kind of along there and with some of the first wavers, kind of near the tail end of the first wave, whenever they were first getting together and originally putting out albums such as Bleach and some of their original demos and things like that. Definitely one of the most important bands of the genre, just not one of the top spots. Nirvana has had an influence on rock music after this, with Dave Grohl forming the Foo Fighters after the dissolution of Nirvana, and they of course have become one of the most important hard rock or just straight up alternative rock bands. But as far as grunge is concerned, where Nirvana died, their grunge affiliation kind of died. If you want to get into the post-grunge argument, go right ahead, but I'm not going to listen to it. Number 6, we have Green River and Mudhoney. Remember how I was talking about first wave bands? This is basically a first wave band that became another first wave band. Green River and Mudhoney were some of the first bands to ever incorporate the whole grunge philosophy, or the grunge sound, so to speak. Green River especially, considering they were the earliest incantation of the sound in general. They only put out one album, a couple of EPs. Mudhoney was kind of in the same boat. They were kind of short-lived little projects that basically borrowed around with different people and gave some people, basically through Green River and Mudhoney, you could consider them the roots of grunge that eventually bore the trees that were then chopped down, and the wood was used in other mills by other bands, and we then had all of the lovely grunge products that we enjoy today. How wood incorporates into flannel, I have no idea, but believe me, the metaphor fits. Green River and Mudhoney's importance is in the fact that they were really able to formulate the sound. They were really able to help redefine the attitude, and even though their real stamp on the grunge genre was not a very lengthy one, it was definitely one that was very important and felt by many. Speaking of a band that is felt by many, let's talk about number 5, Temple of the Dog / Pearl Jam. I have to include the slash because, thanks to Temple of the Dog, we got Pearl Jam. That's right. Temple of the Dog was a tribute project for Andy Wood that featured members of another band, Mother Love Bone, and a couple of vocalists. The first one being Chris Cornell of Soundgarden, and the second one being a relative newcomer, Eddie Vedder. Well, after Eddie Vedder's performance on Temple of the Dog, he was able to form a band with Stone Gossard called Pearl Jam. Yeah. And Pearl Jam's 10 was one of the most important benchmarks of the grunge genre as well. Really showcasing a diversity, this is a band that also kind of suffered the same fate as a Stone Temple Pilots, where the grunge ideal was kind of shaded away from them because of an album such as Versus and as their discography has moved forward. However, where they're from and what they've originally stood for has always been an important part of Pearl Jam's philosophy, along with, philanthropy. Yeah, Eddie Vedder's kind of a weird type. However, Temple of the Dog's lone album, the tribute album for Andy Wood, is a monumental grunge metal classic. Songs such as Hunger Strike, Say Hello to Heaven, these are just songs that really resonate with you, and they really bleed out the whole concept of death and different ideas that really circulated around Andy Wood's music. Speaking of Andy Wood, this list would be incomplete without him. Number 4, Mother Love Bone. Mother Love Bone also only released one album, and it was Apple. And this album, as I have said before in my reviews of this album, is just absolutely incredible. Andy Wood is one of those personalities that you basically only meet once in a lifetime, and usually these are the people that die young. The good die young, pricks live forever. Andy Wood is hopelessly addicted to heroin, releases one of the best grunge albums of all time, doesn't even live to see what it's able to do. It's exactly what happened. Before the release of Apple, Andy Wood was found dead. And the result was the fact that before Apple even got the opportunity to showcase its grandeur to the world, Mother Love Bone has effectively ceased to exist. However, the resulting album, the album that was released, is magnificent. Andy Wood feels like a preacher that is preaching to a choir of children, a flock of sheep, so to speak. And he's able to do so with a voice that's larger than life from a body that really was not. It was a tremendous release. Chloe Dancer, Crown of Thorns was used in, I believe, Dawson's Creek. And you can still feel shrouds of Mother Love Bone here and there. However, you really need to look a little bit, and you definitely should. If you have never heard of Mother Love Bone, what the hell are you waiting for? This is a band that I recommend to almost every person that I know who's into rock and roll or grunge music, and now I'm giving it to all of you guys in the Cover Killer Nation universe once again. Number 3, Alice in Chains. Alice in Chains is another kind of story that ends with tragedy, but this one actually has a little bit of a bookend with redemption. They were originally a band that modeled their name after Guns N' Roses, Alice in Chains, that then became just simply Alice in Chains whenever they released their debut album, Facelift, and had already garnered a lot of attention. These guys took the grunge idea and took it to a darker level, almost incorporating more of a heavy metal element. It's to the point where a lot of people debate whether or not these guys are really incorporated with the grunge bands at all. However, I like to lump them in because there's a lot of signature parts of their sound, a lot of that dark, dank atmosphere that really seems representative of the Seattle tone of that area. Not to mention, just because they did something a little bit heavier doesn't necessarily disassociate them from the scene completely. An album such as Dirt is one of the most perfect albums that I have ever laid my ears on, and the atmosphere, once again, is also something that was touched with a side project, which is Mad Season. It's funny that I believe it was Jeff Amont or Stone Gossard, one of the two, that actually had their parts and their greedy paws in, projects from some of the most prominent names in the grunge universe. Temple of the Dog, Mad Season, Pearl Jam. So basically you have Eddie Vedder, you have Lane Staley, and you have, of course, Chris Cornell. That is an awesome thing to have on a resume. Mad Season was a little bit more bleak, and it was a little bit more simplistic also. Very blues-laden. Something that almost doesn't seem like it fits in the realm of the grunge universe. It merely does because of the players in this ball. And let me tell you something, Above is a hell of an album too. It's one that definitely rides on your emotions, and rides them well. Number 2, Soundgarden. Chris Cornell and the boys just returned with King Animal last year, and let me tell you something, these guys have been going at this for a very, very, very long time. We're talking since the middle part of the 1980s, which makes them one of the longest running, still active grunge bands alive. Now, are they necessarily still making the grunge sound? Not completely. King Animal was actually a very different sounding album that incorporated a lot of elements from Chris Cornell's solo career, as well as some of the elements that made Soundgarden a very famous band. And, of course, there is that tricky idea that this album came after 15 years of dormancy, considering they themselves had their own falling out after the release of Down on the Upside. However, at their heyday, with albums such as Louder Than Love, with albums such as Bad Motorfinger, Super Unknown, and things of that regard, yes, this band was definitely a very, very important force in grunge. Just consider the ideas and the names of the songs that you could rattle off of Super Unknown and Bad Motorfinger by itself. Rusty Cage, Fell on Black Days, Blow Up the Outside World off of A-Sides, Burden in My Hand off of Down on the Upside, just to name a few, Spoon Man. Need I go on? Did I even mention Black Hole Sun? I almost didn't even have to mention Black Hole Sun. Soundgarden is important not only because of their longevity, but because of what they've been able to do for the music scene in general, and maintaining the fact that grunge still has a little bit of relevance. While Audioslave didn't necessarily have that same glimmer and glint of grunge, considering it had Rage Against the Machine's backing band without Zach De La Rocha at Chris Cornell's disposal, his voice still shines forth on their albums as that kind of raspy, grungy truth. So, in a way, you could almost consider Audioslave as post-grunge. Either that, or you could almost loosely try to associate them under the grunge umbrella. It's a real stretch. It's one that's not going to win a lot of arguments, so I don't recommend using it. I only used it as an example that Chris Cornell is one of those timeless voices that echoes for generations. So, we've hit all of the major ones. What about number 1? Who could it possibly be? Well, number 1's actually going to be kind of a surprise because you don't normally associate them with grunge all of that much. Number 1's the Melvins. The Melvins are an important historical musical source in the fact that they are about 30 to almost 35 years strong. Actually, it's 30 years. They're probably easily going to make it to 35. I don't see them quitting anytime soon. One of the biggest reasons why they top this list is influence. Their influence on the grunge scene is magnificently huge. This is something where they ran around with these same bands, where they were able to perform with some of these same bands, the Mudhoneys, the Green Rivers, the Soundgardens, the Nirvanas of the world. And these are all people that idolized the Melvins for their sound. Their sound is at points very fuzzed out, it's at points very, very hard to describe, and it's at points just basically the Melvins doing whatever the fuck they wanted. That's the one thing that I think a lot of grunge fans, aficionados, band members, and musicians had a ton of respect for. They had a ton of respect that these guys basically wrote music the way that they felt. And they basically did it because they wanted to. They didn't necessarily give a damn whether or not they were receiving airplay on MTV. They didn't really give two twats whether or not they were getting, airplay on the radio. These guys were writing music for music's sake, and that's kind of what grunge was all about. Consider the fact that Kurt Cobain never wanted to be famous. Do you think he never wanted to be famous as a musician just because that was vogue? That was cool? No, take a look at the Melvins. The Melvins didn't really have anything but underground acclaim. They're praised by many people, absolutely, so in a way they're famous, but in a way they were able to do things for themselves. That's a very, very alluring charm, and this is a band that definitely was able to execute it. Their albums from the 1980s to the early 1990s all are very, very classic in their own respective ways. That's another thing about these guys that makes them so incredible and so important to the grunge puzzle, is in the fact that they were exclusively dynamic. They were a band that had a lot of different facets to them. Consider their most recent releases. Consider the Freak Puke release from Melvins Light just last year. This is a band that's willing to take on just about anything, no matter how weird. And that's something that has to be extremely gratifying. That's something that definitely has the wind of grunge all over it. Consider some of the songs that you heard off of the grunge albums from bands that I just mentioned. Some of them are extremely serious. Some of them are extremely dark. But most of them are just kind of fun. And that's kind of the point. They were making music for music's sake. They got big because, well, a couple of albums got the attention, and then the whole scene blew up. But the Melvins, they were definitely not only a catalyst, but also a provider of all of this enjoyment. So there you have it. I know it wasn't exactly 10 bands, but let's face it, with a history kind of like the one that grunge has, you almost have to dive into more than just one band with one position. So I hope you guys enjoyed this list. I hope you guys click the subscribe button, and I'll talk to you guys later.